In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about the ancient and modern brain structures.
Now, we've already established the idea that these little frames of reference or maps or stories or whatever you call them, I'll call them stories, I think, from here on in, are little goal-directed units, and they're units of conception and emotion and perception and behavior. They're little sub-personalities. And the sub-personality has an initial starting point and a destination point, and then it can implement behaviors to transform the starting point into the destination point. And then you might say, well, what forms these little sub-personalities? And the answer to that is very complex, but one answer is fundamental motivations. And so I arranged the fundamental motivations on this particular diagram, pointing out that you can roughly consider motivations as those that maintain you and those that propagate you. Now, it's just a heuristic, it's just a way of thinking about it. Under self-maintenance, there's thermoregulation, thirst, hunger, and elimination. There's all sorts of other things as well, but those will do for the time being. And then under self-propagation, there's affiliative desire and sexual desire. Now, the thing that's quite interesting about all this is that, you know, there are brain structures that underlie these the manifestation of these fundamental sub-personalities. Now, people tend to think about them either as motivations or emotions, and I think that's another useful heuristic in that you could say, roughly speaking, that a motivation pops up an entire frame of reference and an emotion tends to orient you within that frame of reference. But that's only a conceptual simplification, because what you see when you look at the actual brain structures is that there isn't an emotion center. There are a bunch of micro units in the brain, and there are separable micro units for different emotions and different motivations, and they don't necessarily have that much in common in terms of their locale, except that they tend to be relatively deep in the brain. So some are hypothalamic, and some are in the amygdala, and some are in the periaqueductal gray, which seems to be responsible for pain responses. And so we can classify things as motivations and emotions, but that doesn't map one-to-one on the underlying brain structures. So now, I think what we'll do with regards to talking about the brain is we'll start from the bottom up. And it's appropriate to start from the bottom up because you are more dependent on your ancient brain structures than you are on your modern brain structures, in that if you damage your modern brain structures, and I mean relatively modern, let's say the ones that have really evolved in great detail over the last 2 million years, the cortical cap, particularly the prefrontal cortex, a lot of the visual cortex. If you damage that, you can pretty much go on. Now, you know, you're going to have one impairment or another impairment, but you can still stay alive. However, there are structures that are lower down that if you damage, that's the end of you. So, for example, the ascending reticular activating system, which is the thing that wakes you up when you're asleep at night when a noise occurs that shouldn't occur. It seems to be the activating center for consciousness, whatever that means. It's way deep down in the brain. It's way down at the top of the spinal cord, roughly speaking. And if you twist your head in a car accident a little bit too roughly and you shear off the ascending fibers, then you're in a coma permanently and nothing can wake you up. And that's pretty interesting, you know, that consciousness, which we think of, again, you know, our tendency is to think about that as a function of the higher cortical systems, is dependent completely on something that's unbelievably ancient. So, you know, and it begs the question, well, at exactly what level of neuronal complexity do you have to be before you have some consciousness? And the answer to that is, we don't know, because the relationship between consciousness and neuronal structure is insanely complex. So, for example, you have very neuron heavy structures in your brain, like the cerebellum, which has about as many, it has a very rough outer coating like the cortex, and it has about as many neurons as the cortical sheet does, and yet you can take it out of people. They don't seem to show any impairment of consciousness, but they get ataxic and they can't control their behavior that well. They have a hard time guiding it. But that seems to be more or less it. Now, it isn't, because there is other things the cerebellum does, but my point is you can have massively neuron-heavy structures that seem to be related in very minimal ways to our experience of consciousness. You know, and your autonomic nervous system is sort of like that too. There's a lot of neurons in your autonomic nervous system, but I think it's a mistake to say that we're precisely conscious of our autonomic nervous system, although now and then we're conscious of its outputs. You know, it governs the operation of our organs and all the things that are so complex that we aren't allowed to mess with them as conscious beings. But it's not conscious, and then, well, somehow some neurons are conscious, and I tell you, we don't know anything about consciousness. We really don't. We don't have a clue. And I think it's probably because we're formulating the question wrong. You know, those people, there are people who are materialist reductionists, and they believe that consciousness is an emergent property of the underlying neuronal function. But the problem with that philosophy is that it's predicated on the assumption that they understand what the matter is that's making up that neuronal substrate. And I can tell you that by the time we are able to reduce consciousness to its underlying material structure, we'll think of whatever matter is in a way that's completely different than the way we think of it now. You know, so there might be an eventual reduction, but at the same time there's going to be a transformation of the theories. You know, it's clear that we don't understand material that well, particularly because when you go down into the underlying, you know, the tiny underlying substructures at the subatomic level, it behaves in a very, very peculiar manner. So anyways, you know, all bets are off with regards to consciousness, but it also does seem to be something that's likely very ancient, you know, and you know, there are people who've attributed consciousness to insects. Insects, by the way, seem to go out of their way to take hallucinogenic drugs, which is quite interesting. So the fly agaric, for example, is a mushroom that it's the famous red and white mushroom that you always see in fairy tales and in Super Mario Brothers, and like it pops up everywhere. And flies will come and take a bite of it, and then they fall unconscious beside the mushroom, and they stay there for like 10 or 15 minutes, and then they get up, but they'll go eat it again. And reindeer really like them too, and they get blitzed out of their mind on Amanita muscarius. And so there's evidence for the desire to transform states of consciousness way, way down in the animal kingdom, way farther than you'd think. So